My name is David Hayes. I'm 47 years old. I've spent the last 23 years of my life surrounded by books, theories, and the kind of silence that comes from deep thinking. What I never expected was that the same silence would be mistaken for ignorance at a simple library book sale on a Saturday morning in October. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Community Library's annual book sale was something I'd heard about but never attended. I'd been living in this small town for only 3 months, keeping to myself mostly, trying to find some peace after everything that happened. I wore what I always wore on weekends, faded jeans with a small tear near the left knee, an old gray sweater that had seen better decades, and worn sneakers that had walked through more university hallways than most people see in a lifetime. I wasn't trying to make an impression, I was just trying to blend in. The book sale was held in the library's main hall, tables arranged in neat rows with handwritten signs marking different categories: fiction, mystery, romance, history, biography. The usual suspects. I moved slowly through the aisles, not because I couldn't decide what to buy, but because I was savoring the moment of being anonymous among the stacks again. For the first time in months, nobody knew my name or what I used to do. The first sign of trouble came at the philosophy section. I'd picked up a worn copy of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and was examining the margins, noting the previous owner's penciled annotations. A woman in her 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and a volunteer badge that read, "Margaret, 15 years," approached me with the kind of smile reserved for children and the mentally impaired. "Oh, honey," she said, gently taking the book from my hands. "This might be a little advanced for you. Have you looked at our romance section? We have some wonderful stories with pictures." I stared at her for a moment, the book suspended between us like a question mark. "I'm fine with this one," I said quietly. She tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "Are you sure? Philosophy can be quite challenging. There's no shame in starting with something easier." She gestured toward a display of children's picture books. "Or perhaps you'd prefer our audiobook collection? Sometimes listening is easier than reading." I could have corrected her. I could have mentioned that I'd taught philosophy for 15 years at 3 different universities. I could have told her that I'd written my doctoral dissertation on Nietzsche's influence on modern ethical theory. Instead, I simply said, "I'll manage." But Margaret wasn't finished. She called over to another volunteer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a red vest. "Harold, could you help this gentleman find something more appropriate? He's interested in reading, but..." She lowered her voice to what she clearly thought was a whisper. "I don't think philosophy is quite right for his level." Harold adjusted his glasses and looked me up and down, taking in my casual appearance, my silence, and apparently finding me wanting. "Of course, Margaret. Sir, we have a wonderful selection of beginner books. Large print if that helps. Simple stories. Maybe some how-to guides for practical skills." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a familiar weight. It was the same feeling I'd carried for months. The sense of being misunderstood. Of having my worth measured by appearances rather than substance. But I was tired of fighting. Tired of proving myself to people who had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. "Thank you," I said, setting the Nietzsche back on the table. "I'll look around." As I moved to the next table, I heard Margaret whisper to Harold, "Poor thing. Probably lives in one of those assisted living places. It's sweet that he wants to try, though." The history section wasn't any better. I'd found a biography of Winston Churchill and was reading the first few pages when a younger volunteer, maybe in her 30s, with an overly bright smile, materialized beside me. "That's a big book," she said, speaking slowly and clearly as if English might not be my first language. "Are you looking for something specific? Maybe something shorter?" "I'm browsing," I replied. "Browsing is great," she said with the enthusiasm of someone praising a toddler for using the bathroom independently. "But sometimes browsing can be overwhelming. Would you like me to recommend something? We have some lovely coffee table books with lots of pictures. History can be so much more enjoyable when you can see what happened, don't you think?" I closed the Churchill biography and placed it back on the table. Around me, other customers were selecting books, chatting with volunteers about authors and recommendations, being treated like adults capable of making their own choices. But somehow, I had been marked as different. The quiet man in old clothes who probably couldn't handle real books. The science section proved to be the breaking point. I'd found a collection of essays on quantum mechanics, a subject I'd studied extensively during my graduate work, when Margaret appeared again, this time with backup. 2 other volunteers flanked her, forming a semicircle around me like I was a lost child in a department store. "Now, dear," Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I really think you're making this harder than it needs to be. Science books can be very confusing, even for people who read well. Why don't we find you something nice and simple? Maybe a cookbook? Everyone loves to cook." I looked at the 3 of them, their faces arranged in expressions of gentle concern mixed with barely concealed impatience. They had decided I was someone to be managed, redirected, handled with kid gloves. They saw my silence as confirmation of their assumptions, rather than a choice I was making. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady despite the heat building in my chest, "but I'm perfectly capable of choosing my own books." Harold stepped forward, his tone taking on a slightly sharper edge. "Sir, we're just trying to help. There's no need to be defensive. We've been running this book sale for years, and we know what works for different people. Maybe you should consider that we might know better than you do about what you can handle." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire someone had forgotten to extinguish. Around us, the casual chatter of other book sale customers continued, but I felt isolated in this bubble of judgment and assumption. These people, who knew nothing about me beyond my appearance and my quietness, had appointed themselves the arbiters of my intellectual capacity. I could feel other customers glancing our way, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition of witnessing something unpleasant. A few older patrons nodded approvingly at the volunteers, clearly agreeing that someone needed to guide this poor, simple man away from books that were obviously beyond his comprehension. Margaret crossed her arms, her volunteer badge catching the fluorescent light. "We're not trying to be mean, dear. We're trying to help you avoid disappointment. These academic books are written for people with advanced degrees, people who've spent years studying these subjects. There's nothing wrong with staying in your lane." My lane? As if intellectual curiosity had traffic rules. As if the pursuit of knowledge required a license they could revoke based on appearance. I thought about all the students I'd taught who had been told similar things, who had been steered away from challenging subjects because someone decided they didn't look the part. I thought about the papers I'd published, the conferences I'd spoken at, the years I'd spent in libraries just like this one, surrounded by books that had shaped not just my career, but my understanding of the world. But mostly I thought about the last few months, about why I was here in this small town, why I'd left everything behind to start over in a place where nobody knew my name or my history. I'd come here to be anonymous, to heal from wounds that had nothing to do with books or degrees or professional recognition. I'd wanted to disappear for a while, to find some peace in obscurity. I just hadn't expected obscurity to come with such a high cost to my dignity. The quantum mechanics book felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it should have been. I looked at Margaret, then at Harold, then at the 3rd volunteer whose name tag read, Susan, new volunteer. I could see in their faces that they were waiting for me to back down, to accept their judgment, and shuffle off to whatever section they deemed appropriate for someone like me. Instead, I opened the book to a random page and began reading aloud, my voice clear and steady. The fundamental principle of quantum superposition states that any 2 or more quantum states can be added together, or superposed, and the result will be another valid quantum state. I looked up at them. Should I continue, or would you prefer I stick to picture books about cooking? For a moment, the 3 volunteers stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. Then Margaret recovered, her smile returning but tighter than before. "Well, anyone can read words aloud, dear. That doesn't mean you understand what they mean." And that's when I heard it. A voice from behind me, calm and familiar, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Commander Hayes? Is that you?" I turned slowly, my heart suddenly racing in a way it hadn't since I'd arrived in this quiet town. Standing near the biography section was Dr. Elizabeth Chen. Her dark hair, now streaked with silver, wire-rimmed glasses, perched on her nose, wearing a simple blue cardigan over dark slacks. She looked exactly as I remembered her from our last faculty meeting at Northwestern, except for the surprise and something else in her eyes that might have been concern. "Elizabeth," I said quietly, the quantum mechanics book still in my hands. "I didn't expect to see you here." The 3 volunteers looked between us with confusion, their certainty about my intellectual limitations suddenly shaken. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to ask a question, but couldn't quite form the words. Elizabeth stepped closer, ignoring the volunteer audience entirely. "What are you doing in Riverside? Last I heard, you were on sabbatical from the university." She paused, studying my face with the careful attention I remembered from our collaboration on research projects. "David, are you all right?" The simple question nearly undid me. For 3 months, I'd been living in a small apartment above a hardware store, working part-time at a local garden center, speaking to almost no one about anything more complex than soil pH or watering schedules. I'd told myself it was temporary, a break from the academic world that had become too complicated, too painful to navigate. But hearing my name spoken by someone who knew me, really knew me, made me realize how much of myself I'd been hiding. "I'm fine," I said, which was both true and completely false. "Just taking some time away from teaching." Elizabeth nodded, but her expression suggested she understood more than I was saying. She'd been there during the worst of it, had witnessed the department politics that had slowly strangled my passion for academia. She'd seen what happened when Dr. Patricia Whitman arrived as the new department head, bringing with her a vision of philosophy that had no room for my research or my methods. Margaret cleared her throat loudly, clearly uncomfortable with being ignored. "Excuse me, but we were having a conversation with this gentleman about finding appropriate reading material." Elizabeth turned to look at Margaret with the polite but steely expression she used to reserve for undergraduate students who hadn't done the reading. "Appropriate reading material?" "Yes," Harold interjected, stepping forward. "We were trying to help him find something more suitable for his reading level. He was looking at very advanced books, and we were concerned he might be frustrated or confused." I watched Elizabeth's face change, saw the moment she fully grasped what had been happening. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected professors in our department. "I see," she said. "And what led you to conclude that Dr. Hayes needed your guidance in selecting books?" The word "doctor" hit the volunteers like a physical blow. Susan, the newest volunteer, actually took a step backward. Harold's face flushed red above his wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Hayes?" Margaret stammered. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize he didn't mention." "Commander Hayes, actually," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing warmer as she looked at me, "though he never insisted on the title. David served as a naval intelligence officer for 8 years before completing his PhD in philosophy at Yale. He specialized in ethics and decision theory, published extensively on moral reasoning in high-stress environments." She paused, letting this information settle. "He also holds degrees in mathematics and cognitive science." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, other book sale customers had begun to notice the commotion, drawn by the tension, and Elizabeth's clear, carrying voice. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced since leaving the university. I'd come to Riverside precisely to escape being defined by my credentials, and now here they were, laid out like evidence in a trial. "The last time I saw Dr. Hayes," Elizabeth continued, "he was presenting his research on moral decision-making in combat situations to a joint conference of philosophy and military ethics scholars. His work has been cited in military training programs and referenced in congressional testimony about rules of engagement." She looked directly at Margaret. "I believe he can handle Nietzsche." Harold opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The quantum mechanics book in my hand suddenly felt lighter, but the weight in my chest had only grown heavier. I didn't want this attention, this public vindication that came at the cost of my carefully maintained anonymity. "Elizabeth," I said softly, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, but her tone was gentle. "David, What happened at Northwestern wasn't your fault. Patricia Whitman's campaign against your research was academic politics at its worst, and everyone knew it. The mention of Whitman's name made my stomach clench. Dr. Patricia Whitman had arrived at Northwestern 2 years ago with impeccable credentials and a vision for the philosophy department that involved eliminating what she called pseudo-philosophical applications. My research into military ethics, my work with active duty officers on moral reasoning under extreme pressure, my collaboration with psychologists and military trainers, all of it fell under her definition of academic impurity. She'd made it clear from her first faculty meeting that she considered my work more suited to a social work department than a serious philosophy program. When my research grant came up for renewal, she'd argued against it. When I'd proposed a new course on applied ethics in military contexts, she'd blocked it. When students requested to work with me on thesis projects related to my area of expertise, she'd steered them toward other faculty members. The final blow had come 6 months ago, when she'd called me into her office to discuss what she termed my, quote, future alignment with departmental goals. She'd sat behind her polished desk, my personnel file open in front of her, and explained that the university was moving in a new direction. My research was too narrow, too applied. My background in military service, while personally admirable, didn't align with the theoretical rigor she expected from philosophy faculty. Perhaps, she'd said with a smile that never reached her eyes, you'd be happier in a program that values practical applications over philosophical depth. I hear the education department is always looking for people with your unique perspective. I'd sat in that office, listening to her essentially call me a second-rate philosopher disguised as career guidance, and felt something inside me break. Not anger. I'd been too tired for anger. Just a quiet recognition that I no longer belonged in the world I'd spent 15 years building. Elizabeth had been the only colleague who'd fought for me, who'd argued in faculty meetings that my work represented exactly the kind of philosophical engagement the world needed more of, not less. But she'd been outnumbered by newer faculty members who saw alignment with Whitman as crucial to their own career advancement. You left because of her, Elizabeth said now, her voice carrying across the library book sale with uncomfortable clarity. You left because Patricia Whitman couldn't see past her own narrow definition of what philosophy should be. Margaret, Harold, and Susan stood frozen, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding about book selections. Other customers had begun to gather at the edges of our conversation, drawn by the drama unfolding among the biography tables. Elizabeth, please, I said, feeling the walls I'd built around my new life beginning to crack. That's not why I'm here. But she wasn't finished. You published 17 peer-reviewed articles, David. You consulted for 3 different military academies. Your work on ethical decision-making saved careers, maybe saved lives. And Patricia Whitman pushed you out because your research didn't fit her idea of pure philosophy. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, saw curiosity, embarrassment, fascination. These people had come to a simple book sale and found themselves witnesses to the unraveling of a story they didn't understand. Margaret's face had gone pale, and she kept glancing between Elizabeth and me as if trying to reconcile this information with the man she'd been treating like a child 15 minutes earlier. I didn't leave because of her, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I left because I started believing her. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth's expression softened, and I saw in her eyes the recognition of something she'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. The confident, accomplished professor she'd known had been worn down by months of subtle undermining, of having his work dismissed and his expertise questioned, until he'd begun to doubt his own worth. David, she said gently, you know that's not true. But it was true, or at least it had felt true for long enough that I'd stopped fighting it. When you spend months having your life's work dismissed as intellectually lightweight, when colleagues stop making eye contact in the hallways, when graduate students stop requesting your supervision, you begin to wonder if maybe the critics are right. Maybe your research isn't rigorous enough. Maybe your background in military service has made you too practical, too concerned with real-world applications to be a serious academic. Maybe you don't belong in the world of ideas after all. I'd left Northwestern not in anger but in defeat, convinced that Patricia Whitman had been right about me all along. I was a decent teacher, a competent researcher, but not a true philosopher. I was someone who'd stumbled into academia and had finally been found out. The garden center job in Riverside had felt appropriate. Physical work, simple problems with clear solutions. No one questioned whether my approach to composting was sufficiently theoretical or whether my advice on plant care met rigorous academic standards. I could be useful without having to prove my intellectual worth to anyone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Until today, when 3 volunteers at a library book sale had looked at me and decided I couldn't handle real books. Until Elizabeth Chen had appeared like a ghost from my former life and forced me to confront everything I'd been running from. The sound of quick footsteps across the library's marble floor interrupted the heavy silence that had settled around us. A woman in her 50s with short auburn hair and a navy blazer was approaching our group with purposeful strides, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. I recognized her immediately as someone I'd seen behind the main circulation desk during my few visits to the library, though we'd never spoken. "Is everything all right over here?" she asked, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to managing situations. Her name tag identified her as Helen Morrison, head librarian, and her sharp eyes quickly assessed the scene before her. 3 flustered volunteers, a dozen curious onlookers, Elizabeth Chen looking protective, and me standing in the middle holding a book on quantum mechanics like evidence in a trial. Margaret stepped forward quickly, clearly eager to control the narrative. "Helen, we were just helping this gentleman find some appropriate reading material. There was a small misunderstanding, but Dr. Chen here has clarified things." Helen's gaze moved between Margaret and me, and I saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "Dr. Chen? As in Professor Chen from Northwestern's philosophy department?" Elizabeth nodded. "That's right. I was just explaining to your volunteers that they may have made some incorrect assumptions about Dr. Hayes here." "Dr. Hayes," Helen repeated slowly, her eyes focusing on me with new intensity. Something clicked behind her expression, and she tilted her head slightly. "David Hayes? Commander Hayes?" The use of my military title sent a small shock through the gathered crowd. I nodded reluctantly, feeling more exposed with each revelation. "Yes, ma'am." Helen's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The polite concern of a head librarian managing a difficult situation transformed into something approaching awe. "Commander Hayes, I cannot believe you're here. I've been trying to reach you for months." The confusion on Margaret's face deepened, and Harold looked like he was struggling to process information that didn't fit his preconceptions. Around us, the circle of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the unfolding drama. "Reach me?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Helen smiled, and for the first time since this entire situation began, it was a smile without condescension or hidden agenda. "Commander, we've been trying to locate you to discuss a very special donation to our library. The Riverside Community Library was selected to house the Captain Robert Chen Memorial Collection of Military Ethics and Philosophy." Elizabeth gasped softly beside me. "Bobby's collection? They're donating Bobby's books?" Helen nodded solemnly. "Captain Chen's family decided to donate his entire personal library to a public institution rather than a university, somewhere that would make his research accessible to everyone. The collection includes over 3,000 volumes on military history, ethics, philosophy, and strategic studies, plus his personal papers and research notes." I remembered Captain Robert Chen, Elizabeth's younger brother, a Marine Corps officer who'd been killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago. He'd been a brilliant student of military ethics, someone who'd corresponded with scholars across the country about the intersection of moral philosophy and military service. I'd exchanged several letters with him about my own research, and his insights had influenced some of my later papers. "The family specifically requested that we find someone qualified to oversee the collection," Helen continued. "Someone with expertise in both military service and academic philosophy. Your name came up immediately when we described our needs to the university's philosophy department. Dr. Whitman herself recommended you." The irony of Patricia Whitman recommending me for anything was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Of course she would recommend me for a position that would take me away from Northwestern permanently, that would validate her argument that my work belonged in public service rather than serious academia. I had no idea, I said quietly. No one contacted me. Helen looked embarrassed. We sent multiple letters to your university address, left voicemails at your office. When we didn't hear back, we assumed you weren't interested. It wasn't until last week that we learned you'd taken a leave of absence. Margaret, who had been growing paler with each new revelation, finally found her voice. I don't understand. He's been coming here for weeks, and he never said anything about being a professor or a commander or anything. I looked at her, this woman who 15 minutes ago had been steering me toward picture books, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. I didn't say anything because I wanted to be treated like everyone else, I said. I wanted to browse books and buy coffee and have conversations about the weather without anyone measuring my words against my degrees. I paused, looking around at the faces surrounding us. I wanted to be judged by who I am now, not by who I used to be. But you're still who you used to be, Elizabeth said gently. Leaving Northwestern doesn't change the value of your work or your expertise. Helen stepped closer, her expression earnest. Commander Hayes, I hope you'll consider our offer. The Chen Memorial Collection deserves someone who understands both the academic rigor and the practical applications of military ethics. From what I've read of your work, you're exactly what Captain Chen would have wanted for his books. I looked down at the quantum mechanics book still in my hands, thinking about the strange path that had led me from Patricia Whitman's dismissive office to this library book sale, from academic rejection to this unexpected opportunity. Captain Chen's collection would need someone who understood the weight of moral decisions in combat, someone who'd lived the questions his books explored. The position would involve cataloging and organizing the collection, developing educational programs around military ethics, and serving as a resource for students, veterans, and community members interested in these topics, Helen explained. It's not a traditional academic appointment, but it would allow you to continue your research and teaching in a different context. Susan, the newest volunteer who had barely spoken throughout this entire encounter, suddenly raised her hand like a student in class. I'm sorry, but I'm still confused. If you're this accomplished scholar and military officer, why didn't you just tell us? Why did you let us treat you like... She trailed off, realizing how her question sounded, but I understood what she was asking. Why had I accepted their condescension? Why had I allowed them to redirect me towards simple books when I could have immediately established my credentials? Because I wanted to see who you were when you thought I was powerless, I said simply. I wanted to understand how you treat people when you believe they can't fight back. The words settled over the group like dust after an explosion. Margaret's face flushed deep red, and Harold removed his glasses to clean them unnecessarily. Around us, the other book sale customers began to murmur among themselves, processing what they'd witnessed. David, Elizabeth said softly, you don't have to accept condescension to prove a point about human nature. She was right, of course. But after months of having my expertise questioned and my worth diminished by Patricia Whitman, I'd begun to believe that maybe I deserved dismissive treatment. Maybe the volunteers' assumptions about me reflected some truth I'd been unwilling to acknowledge. Helen cleared her throat gently. Commander Hayes, regardless of what happened here today, the offer stands. Captain Chen's collection needs someone who understands its significance. Would you be willing to meet with me next week to discuss the details? I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd learned something unexpected about judgment and assumption. Margaret was staring at her hands, clearly mortified by her behavior. Harold was whispering intensely to another volunteer, probably trying to process how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Susan looked like she was mentally replaying every interaction she'd had with library patrons, wondering how many other assumptions she'd made. But it was Elizabeth's face that decided me. She was looking at me with the same expression she'd worn during our best faculty meetings, when we'd discussed research projects that might actually make a difference in the world. It was the look of someone who saw possibility where others saw problems. Yes, I said to Helen. I'd like to discuss the position. The tension in the room began to dissolve as people realized the drama was ending on a positive note. Some of the onlookers began to drift back to their book browsing, though I caught several of them glancing back at me with new curiosity. Helen smiled broadly. Excellent. The collection is currently in storage, but we're preparing a special room for it on the library's second floor. Captain Chen's research deserves a proper home. I thought about Robert Chen, a young officer who'd died trying to live up to the ethical principles he'd studied. His books would serve veterans struggling with their own moral questions, students exploring the intersection of service and philosophy, community members trying to understand the complexities of military decision-making. It was work that mattered, work that could make a real difference in people's lives. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret approached me hesitantly. Dr. Hayes, I owe you an enormous apology. I made assumptions that were completely unfair and, frankly, insulting. I hope you can forgive me. I looked at her, this woman who'd spoken to me like a child and tried to steer me away from books she deemed too challenging. She looked genuinely mortified, and I realized that her apology was costing her something. We all make assumptions, Margaret, I said. The important thing is what we do when we realize we were wrong. She nodded gratefully and hurried away, probably to tell other volunteers about the morning's events. Harold offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement before retreating to the fiction section, but Susan lingered. Dr. Hayes, she said quietly, I'm new here, and I obviously don't know what I'm doing yet. Could I ask you something? Of course. How do I avoid making the same mistake? How do I treat people fairly when I don't know anything about them? It was a good question, the kind that suggested she'd actually learned something from the morning's events. Assume competence instead of incompetence, I said. Assume people know what they want unless they ask for help. Assume their choices are informed unless they tell you otherwise. She nodded thoughtfully and walked away, and I found myself hoping she'd remember this conversation the next time she encountered someone who didn't fit her expectations. Elizabeth and Helen were discussing the logistics of the Chen Memorial Collection, but I only half listened. I was thinking about the path that had brought me here, from Patricia Whitman's office, to this library book sale, to this unexpected opportunity to honor a fallen soldier's intellectual legacy. Maybe Patricia Whitman had been right about one thing. My work didn't belong in a traditional academic setting. But that didn't mean it didn't belong anywhere. Captain Chen's collection would give me a chance to continue the research that mattered to me, to serve veterans and students and community members who needed to understand the ethical dimensions of military service. I looked down at the quantum mechanics book, still in my hands after all this time. I'd come to the book sale looking for something to read, but I'd found something much more valuable, a reminder that my worth wasn't determined by other people's assumptions or limitations. I walked to the cashier's table and paid for the book, along with the Nietzsche volume I'd originally selected and the Churchill biography I'd been discouraged from purchasing. The elderly woman at the register smiled at me warmly, apparently having heard at least part of the morning's revelations. Those are excellent choices, she said simply, treating me like any other customer making thoughtful selections. Thank you, I replied, and for the first time in months, I meant it completely. 6 months later, I stood in the Captain Robert Chen Memorial Reading Room on the second floor of the Riverside Community Library, watching sunlight stream through tall windows onto carefully arranged shelves of military ethics texts, philosophical treatises, and personal correspondence that had once belonged to a young Marine who'd died asking the right questions about war and morality. The room had taken shape slowly, like a garden growing from carefully planted seeds. Helen Morrison had given me complete creative control over the design and organization, trusting my vision for how Captain Chen's intellectual legacy should be presented to the community. I'd arranged the books not by traditional library categories, but by the questions they explored. What do we owe to our enemies? How do we maintain moral clarity in chaos? When does duty conflict with conscience? The personal touches had come later. A photograph of Captain Chen in dress uniform, provided by his family, sat on a small table near the window. His reading glasses, still in their worn leather case, rested beside a notebook filled with his handwritten observations about Aristotelian virtue ethics applied to modern warfare. Elizabeth had driven down from Chicago to help me arrange these items, and we'd spent an afternoon reading through his letters, discovering the depth of thought behind his formal military bearing. He would have loved this space, she'd said, running her finger along the spine of a book on just war theory that showed evidence of heavy use. Bobby always said, philosophy shouldn't live in ivory towers. It should be where people need it most. The reading room had quickly become more than just a repository for books. Veterans from the local VA hospital began visiting regularly, some drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations, others simply seeking a quiet space to think. I'd started hosting informal discussion groups on Thursday evenings, gatherings that began with a specific text, but invariably evolved into conversations about experiences that couldn't be found in any book. Last week, a young woman named Sarah, recently returned from her second deployment in Syria, had broken down while reading passages from Captain Chen's annotated copy of Michael Walzer's Just War Theory. She'd been struggling with decisions she'd made as a medic, treatments she'd provided to enemy combatants while American soldiers waited for care. The theoretical frameworks in Chen's books hadn't given her easy answers, but they'd given her language for questions she'd been carrying alone. "I thought I was going crazy," she'd whispered during our group discussion, thinking so much about whether I did the right thing. But reading this, seeing his notes, realizing that a Marine officer was asking the same questions, she'd gestured toward Chen's careful marginalia. "It makes me feel less alone with it all." These were the moments that reminded me why I'd left academic philosophy in the first place, why Patricia Whitman's vision of pure theoretical inquiry had felt so hollow. Philosophy wasn't supposed to be an intellectual exercise performed for other philosophers. It was supposed to help people live better lives, make harder choices, find meaning in experiences that defied easy categorization. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia Whitman's dismissal had led me to work that was more philosophically meaningful than anything I'd done in 15 years of university teaching. The Chen Memorial Collection had given me a platform to explore applied ethics in ways that actually mattered to real people facing real moral dilemmas. My phone buzzed with a text message pulling me back to the present moment. It was from Elizabeth. "Saw the article in Philosophy Today about the Chen Collection. Patricia must be furious that you're getting recognition for public philosophy work. Well done." The article she referenced had appeared last month, a feature piece about innovative approaches to making philosophical resources accessible to broader communities. The journalist had interviewed me extensively about the integration of academic philosophy with practical moral guidance, describing the Chen Memorial Collection as a model for community-based philosophical engagement. What Elizabeth couldn't know was that Patricia Whitman had actually called me the day after the article appeared. I'd been shelving books when Helen brought me the phone, her expression suggesting she wasn't sure whether the call would be welcome. "David." Patricia's voice had been carefully controlled, displaying none of the casual dismissiveness I remembered from our last meeting. "I wanted to congratulate you on the article in Philosophy Today. Your work with the Chen Collection sounds innovative." I'd waited for the other shoe to drop, for the subtle criticism that would reveal her true purpose in calling. "I may have been hasty in my assessment of your research trajectory," she'd continued. "The university is developing a new initiative in community engagement, and your current work might be exactly what we need. Would you consider returning to Northwestern in a hybrid position? You could maintain your work with the Chen Collection while teaching graduate seminars on applied ethics." The offer had surprised me, both for its existence and for how little it tempted me. 6 months earlier, such recognition from Patricia Whitman would have felt like vindication, proof that my work had value despite her earlier rejection. But sitting in the Chen Memorial Reading Room, surrounded by books that were actually being used by people who needed them, I'd realized that her approval no longer mattered. "Thank you for thinking of me," I'd replied, "but I'm committed to the work I'm doing here. Captain Chen's collection deserves my full attention." There had been a pause, during which I imagined Patricia calculating whether to sweeten the offer or accept the rejection gracefully. She'd chosen grace, perhaps recognizing that my decision reflected contentment rather than spite. "Well," she'd said finally, "the university's loss is clearly the community's gain. Best of luck with your work, David." The conversation had ended cordially, leaving me with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to feel. Patricia Whitman's opinion of my work, positive or negative, no longer defined my sense of professional worth. I'd found something more valuable than academic validation. Work that felt necessary. The afternoon was growing late, and I began my usual closing routine, ensuring that all books were properly shelved and that Captain Chen's personal items were secured. As I worked, I reflected on how much had changed since that October morning at the library book sale. The volunteers who'd initially dismissed me had become some of my strongest supporters. Margaret now recommended the Chen collection to anyone interested in military history or ethics, and she'd written a thoughtful letter to the local newspaper about the importance of not judging people by appearances. Harold had quietly apologized several times, admitting that his assumptions had reflected poorly on the library's commitment to serving all community members equally. Susan had perhaps changed the most. She'd begun attending our Thursday evening discussions, initially as an observer but gradually becoming an active participant. Her questions were always thoughtful, often focusing on how moral principles applied to civilian life. Last month, she'd confided that working with the Chen collection had inspired her to enroll in philosophy courses at the local community college. "I never thought philosophy was for people like me," she'd said, unconsciously echoing the assumptions she'd once made about my intellectual capacity. But listening to these discussions, seeing how these ideas connect to real life, I realize I was wrong about what philosophy is. These transformations reminded me daily that the morning's humiliation at the book sale had served a purpose beyond my personal vindication. It had forced conversations about assumptions and accessibility that might never have occurred otherwise. The volunteers had learned something about judgment, the community had discovered resources they didn't know they needed, and I had found work that honored both my academic training and my military experience. As I locked the reading room door, I noticed a handwritten note that had been slipped under the threshold. The writing was careful, deliberate. "Dr. Hayes, thank you for helping me understand that asking hard questions about service doesn't make me unpatriotic. It makes me human. The books here have given me permission to think deeply about things I thought I had to accept without question. Semper Fi, Corporal Martinez." I folded the note carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket, where it joined a growing collection of similar messages from visitors who'd found something valuable in Captain Chen's books and the discussions they'd sparked. These notes were better than any academic review, more meaningful than any professional recognition. Walking home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I thought about the unexpected path that had brought me here. I'd come to this town seeking anonymity and healing, running from professional disappointment and personal doubt. I'd found instead a way to transform both my military experience and my academic expertise into something that served others. The garden center where I'd worked part-time had offered me a permanent position when word spread about my background, but I'd politely declined. My hands were better suited to turning pages than planting seeds, and my future lay with Captain Chen's books and the people who needed them. That evening, I sat in my apartment above the hardware store, grading papers from the adult education ethics course I'd begun teaching at the community college. The students were a diverse group: veterans, retirees, working parents, people who'd never imagined themselves capable of philosophical inquiry. Their essays lacked the sophisticated argumentation of graduate student work, but they possessed something more valuable: genuine engagement with moral questions that mattered to their lives. One student, a retired factory worker named Jim, had written about the ethical implications of whistleblowing after witnessing safety violations at his former workplace. Another, Maria, a single mother working 2 jobs, had explored questions about parental duty and personal sacrifice. These weren't abstract intellectual exercises, but real people wrestling with concrete moral dilemmas. As I finished my grading, I realized that Margaret, Harold, and Susan's initial assumptions about my intellectual capacity had inadvertently led me to the most meaningful work of my career. By treating me as someone who couldn't handle complex ideas, they'd forced me to confront my own assumptions about who deserved access to philosophical inquiry. The Chen Memorial Collection had become more than a repository for one Marine's intellectual legacy. It had become a testament to the idea that philosophical thinking belongs wherever people are willing to engage with difficult questions about how to live well. And perhaps that was Captain Robert Chen's greatest gift. Not just his books, but his example of taking moral reasoning seriously enough to die for it. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, grateful for the strange sequence of events that had brought me to this place. Tomorrow would bring new visitors to the reading room, new questions to explore, new opportunities to demonstrate that philosophy's highest purpose isn't to impress other philosophers, but to help ordinary people navigate extraordinary moral complexity. The quantum mechanics book I'd purchased that October morning sat on my bedside table, finally read and thoroughly understood. But it was Captain Chen's worn copy of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that I reached for now, its margins filled with a young marine's thoughts about virtue, courage, and the good life. Some books, I'd learned, were meant to be shared. 2 years had passed since that October morning at the library book sale, and the Captain Robert Chen Memorial Collection had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What began as 3,000 donated books had expanded into a comprehensive resource center that drew visitors from across the region. Military academies sent cadets for research projects. Veterans drove hours to access materials they couldn't find anywhere else. Graduate students from universities in 3 states regularly consulted the collection for their thesis work. But it was the unexpected visitors who reminded me daily why this work mattered. Last Tuesday, a high school student named Marcus had arrived with his grandmother, both of them looking uncertain about whether they belonged in a space dedicated to military ethics and philosophy. Marcus's older brother had been killed in Iraq 2 years earlier, and the family was struggling with questions about whether his sacrifice had meaning, whether the war itself had been justified. I'd spent 3 hours with them that afternoon, not providing easy answers, but helping them find books that explored the complexities of military service, the moral weight of sacrifice, the philosophical frameworks for understanding loss in the context of larger political and ethical questions. Marcus's grandmother had cried while reading a passage from Captain Chen's personal journal about writing letters to fallen comrades' families. "He thought about these things too," she'd whispered, holding the journal like it was sacred. "This young Marine officer, he worried about the same things we worry about. These encounters had taught me something that 15 years in university classrooms never had. Philosophy's greatest power lay not in its complexity, but in its capacity to help people feel less alone with their hardest questions." Captain Chen's collection provided intellectual tools, but more importantly, it provided community for people wrestling with moral dilemmas that had no simple solutions. The recognition had come gradually, then all at once. First, academic journals began publishing articles about the Chen collection as a model for community-based philosophical resources. Then the American Philosophical Association invited me to speak at their annual conference about public philosophy and veteran services. The National Endowment for the Humanities awarded us a substantial grant to expand our educational programming. But the recognition that mattered most had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a letter addressed to Commander Hayes, Director, Chen Memorial Collection. The return address was unfamiliar. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, U.S. Marine Corps, stationed at Quantico. The letter had explained that Colonel Patterson was Captain Chen's former commanding officer, the man who'd written the recommendation for Chen's promotion just weeks before his death. Patterson had heard about the memorial collection through military channels and wanted to contribute something personal to Chen's legacy. "Captain Chen was the finest officer I ever had the privilege to command," Patterson had written. "His questions made all of us better soldiers and better men. He never stopped asking whether we were doing the right thing, not just tactically but morally. I have something I believe belongs with his collection." Patterson had driven to Riverside personally to deliver his contribution. Captain Chen's personal copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, carried through 3 deployments and filled with annotations that revealed the depth of his philosophical engagement with the Stoic tradition. The book was worn nearly to pieces, its pages softened by handling and marked with notes that showed a young officer grappling with ancient wisdom in modern circumstances. He read this book every night, Patterson had told me as we stood together in the memorial reading room, said it helped him remember that being a good soldier meant being a good person first. He quoted Marcus Aurelius during briefings, used Stoic principles to help younger Marines deal with fear and uncertainty. Patterson had paused, looking around the room at the carefully arranged shelves, the comfortable reading chairs, the small display cases containing Chen's personal effects. This is what Bobby would have wanted, not a monument to his death, but a living space where his questions continue to matter. The gift of Chen's personal meditations had completed something in the collection, adding an intimate dimension that transformed it from an academic resource into something more personal and powerful. Visitors often gravitated toward the glass case containing the battered book, drawn by the visible evidence of a young officer's engagement with philosophical questions about duty, mortality, and moral excellence. Elizabeth had returned to Riverside for the formal ceremony dedicating the expanded collection space. She'd brought with her something I hadn't expected: an apology from Northwestern University's philosophy department, delivered through a carefully worded letter from the current department chair. Patricia Whitman resigned last semester, Elizabeth had explained as we walked through downtown Riverside after the ceremony. Turns out her vision of pure theoretical philosophy wasn't producing the kind of graduates or research that the university wanted to support. The new chair, Dr. Williams, has been tasked with rebuilding connections between academic philosophy and practical applications. I'd listened to this news with surprise but little satisfaction. Patricia Whitman's departure didn't validate my work retroactively, just as her criticism hadn't invalidated it originally. The Chen Collection's success stood on its own merits, measured not by academic politics but by its impact on the people who used it. Williams wants to establish a formal partnership between Northwestern and the Chen Collection, Elizabeth had continued. Graduate students could do internships here. Faculty could conduct research collaborations. He's offering you an adjunct professorship that would allow you to design courses specifically around applied military ethics. The offer was generous, the kind of recognition I would have desperately wanted 2 years earlier. But sitting in the reading room where Sarah read Walzer's theories about just war while processing her own experiences as a combat medic, where Marcus found language for his grief over his brother's death, where retired veterans discovered that their moral questions had been asked and answered by philosophers across centuries, I realized that academic validation was no longer what I was seeking. I'm honored by the offer, I'd told Elizabeth, but my work is here now. The collection needs someone who's fully committed to its mission, not divided between university obligations and community service. Elizabeth had smiled, the same expression I remembered from our best collaborative moments at Northwestern. I hoped you'd say that. The work you're doing here matters more than anything happening in most philosophy departments. Bobby would be proud. The mention of her brother had reminded me of something I'd been meaning to discuss with her. Elizabeth, I've been thinking about expanding the collection's scope. There are other families who might want to donate materials, other service members whose intellectual legacies deserve preservation. She'd nodded enthusiastically. The Richardson family contacted me last month. Their daughter Emily was a Navy chaplain who died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. She'd completed a master's degree in theology and ethics, written extensively about moral injury and spiritual healing in combat zones. They're looking for the right place to house her papers and books. The possibility of additional collections excited me in ways that academic publishing never had. Each donation would bring new perspectives to the questions we explored in our evening discussions, new voices to the ongoing conversation about ethics, service, and sacrifice. That evening, as I'd locked up the library and walked home through Riverside's quiet streets, I'd reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from Patricia Whitman's dismissive office to this meaningful work. The humiliation at the book sale had been a catalyst, forcing me to confront my own assumptions about worth and recognition. Elizabeth's intervention had provided immediate vindication, but the real healing had come through months of patient work building something that served others. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Chen Collection. I was organizing new acquisitions when Helen Morrison appeared in the doorway with a young man in his early 20s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. "David, I'd like you to meet Corporal Thomas Chen," Helen said, Captain Chen's younger brother. I stood immediately, recognizing the family resemblance in the young man's serious expression and careful posture. Thomas had his brother's thoughtful eyes and the same way of pausing before speaking, as if weighing each word's importance. "Corporal Chen, it's an honor to meet you," I said, extending my hand. "Your brother's collection has touched more lives than you can imagine." Thomas shook my hand firmly, then looked around the reading room with obvious emotion. "My family told me about what you've built here, but seeing it..." He paused, swallowing hard. Bobby would have loved this. He always said his books were meant to be used, not displayed. We spent the morning touring the collection together, and I watched Thomas discover aspects of his brother's intellectual life that had perhaps been invisible during their shared childhood. The careful annotations in texts on virtue ethics, the correspondence with scholars across the country, the reading lists Thomas had compiled for junior officers, seeking guidance on moral questions. I knew he was smart, Thomas said, holding his brother's annotated copy of Kant's Perpetual Peace. But I didn't realize how deeply he thought about these things, how much he was trying to figure out. Thomas had come to Riverside with a specific purpose. He was finishing his own military service and had been accepted to graduate school in philosophy, inspired by his brother's example and by what he'd learned about the Chen collection's impact. But he was also carrying something he wanted to add to the memorial, Robert's final letter, written 3 days before his death and mailed to his family shortly after. He wrote this knowing he might not make it home, Thomas explained, carefully removing an envelope from his jacket pocket. He asked that if anything happened to him, his book should go somewhere they could help other people ask the questions he was asking. The letter was brief but profound, outlining Robert Chen's vision for how philosophical inquiry could serve military personnel facing moral challenges. He'd written about the isolation of carrying ethical concerns in environments where such questions were often discouraged, about the need for intellectual resources that connected ancient wisdom to modern dilemmas. I want people to know that thinking deeply about right and wrong isn't a luxury in military service, he'd written. It's a necessity. We can't make good decisions in impossible situations without philosophical frameworks that help us understand what we owe to ourselves, our comrades, and the people we're supposed to protect. Reading those words, I understood more clearly why the Chen collection had resonated so powerfully with visitors. It wasn't just providing books or intellectual resources. It was validating the fundamental human need to wrestle with moral questions, especially in circumstances where such wrestling felt like an indulgence or a weakness. Thomas had also brought news that would reshape the collection's future. The Chen family had established a foundation to support educational initiatives related to military ethics and philosophy. They wanted to fund similar collections at libraries across the country, creating a network of community-based resources for veterans, service members, and anyone interested in exploring the moral dimensions of military service. They want you to direct the expansion, Thomas explained. Design the model, train librarians, help other communities establish their own memorial collections. It would mean traveling, consulting, maybe writing a book about what you've learned here. The opportunity was staggering, the kind of platform that could amplify the Chen collection's impact exponentially. But it would also mean leaving Riverside, abandoning the intimate community we'd built around these specific books and discussions. I need time to think about it, I'd told Thomas, though part of me already knew the answer. That afternoon, I'd walked through downtown Riverside, past the hardware store where I lived, past the garden center where I'd worked during my first months in town, past the coffee shop where I'd slowly begun to rebuild my confidence in casual conversations with neighbors who knew nothing about my academic background or military service. I found myself at the park where I often read on weekends, sitting on a bench beside the small pond where ducks gathered expectantly whenever someone approached with food. It was here, in this quiet space, that I'd first begun to imagine what my life might look like beyond the immediate crisis that had brought me to Riverside. 2 years ago, I'd been running from professional failure and personal disappointment, convinced that Patricia Whitman's assessment of my worth was accurate. I'd believed that my work lacked sufficient theoretical rigor, that my practical applications of philosophical principles revealed intellectual inadequacy rather than innovative thinking. The volunteers at the library book sale had simply reinforced what I'd already believed about myself, that I didn't belong among serious thinkers, that my appearance and demeanor marked me as someone who needed guidance, rather than someone capable of providing it. But the Chen collection had taught me something different about worth and recognition. The veterans who found solace in Marcus Aurelius, the students who discovered that moral philosophy connected to their lived experiences, the community members who realized that ancient questions about virtue and duty still mattered in contemporary life. They hadn't cared about my academic credentials or my publications record. They'd cared about whether the books and discussions helped them think more clearly about how to live well, how to make difficult decisions, how to find meaning in service and sacrifice. As I sat by the pond, watching late afternoon sunlight filter through autumn leaves that reminded me of that first October morning at the book sale. I realized that Thomas Chen's offer represented a choice between impact and intimacy. I could help establish memorial collections across the country, reaching thousands of people who might benefit from access to philosophical resources. Or I could stay in Riverside, continuing the deep personal work of facilitating conversations that changed individual lives one Thursday evening at a time. The decision crystallized as I watched an elderly man approach the pond with a bag of breadcrumbs, carefully doling out portions to the gathered ducks with the patience of someone who'd performed this ritual many times before. He noticed me watching and nodded in greeting. "Beautiful afternoon," he said simply. "Yes, it is," I replied, recognizing him as someone I'd seen at the library occasionally, though we'd never spoken. "You're the fellow who runs that military book collection, aren't you?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside me. "My grandson mentioned it. He's been reading some of those books for a school project." I nodded. "The Chen Memorial Collection. Your grandson is welcome anytime." The man smiled, scattering more breadcrumbs for the increasingly bold ducks. "He's been asking me questions I can't answer. About war, about whether fighting is ever right. Lost his father in Iraq when he was young. I never knew what to tell him. This was why I needed to stay in Riverside. Not for the grand gesture of establishing collections across the country, but for conversations like this one. For the grandfather who needed help talking to his grandson about loss and war and meaning. For the individual lives that could be touched by philosophical engagement in intimate, personal ways. "Bring 'em by next Thursday evening," I said. "We have discussion groups. Sometimes the best answers come from listening to other people wrestle with the same questions." The old man nodded gratefully and continued feeding the ducks while I made my decision about Thomas Chen's offer. The next morning, I called the Chen Family Foundation to decline the director position but proposed an alternative. Instead of my leading a national expansion, why not develop the Riverside collection as a training site? Librarians, community leaders, and educators could come here to learn how to establish similar programs in their own communities. We could create a manual, develop curricula, provide ongoing consultation, while maintaining our focus on the local work that had proven so meaningful. The foundation enthusiastically accepted the counterproposal, recognizing that sustainable growth required deep understanding of what made the Chen collection effective. Over the following months, we began hosting quarterly workshops for library professionals interested in developing philosophical and ethical resources for their communities. Elizabeth became our first consultant, taking a sabbatical from Northwestern to help design training programs. Her expertise in academic philosophy complemented my experience with practical applications, and together we created educational materials that bridged the gap between scholarly rigor and community accessibility. "It's the work we always should have been doing," she said one evening as we reviewed feedback from workshop participants. Making philosophy useful instead of just impressive. The workshops brought fascinating people to Riverside, a librarian from rural Montana, whose community included many veterans struggling with moral injury, a philosophy professor from a community college in Texas who wanted to serve undocumented immigrants grappling with questions about citizenship and belonging, a chaplain from an urban hospital seeking resources for medical professionals facing ethical dilemmas. Each visitor added new perspectives to our understanding of how philosophical resources could serve diverse communities. The collection expanded beyond military ethics to include works on medical ethics, environmental philosophy, applied ethics in business and education. Captain Chen's initial vision had grown into something broader but no less focused on practical moral reasoning. The most significant validation came unexpectedly, in the form of a visitor I never thought I'd see again. I was shelving books on a quiet Friday afternoon when Helen Morrison appeared in the doorway with a woman I recognized immediately, but hadn't seen in over 2 years. Patricia Whitman looked older, her perfectly styled hair now showing gray at the temples, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something more uncertain. She was dressed casually, almost hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she belonged in this space. "David," she said quietly when she saw me, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Dr. Morrison told me about the collection, and I wanted to see it for myself." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old reflexive response to her presence. But as I looked at her standing in the reading room surrounded by Captain Chen's books, by evidence of the meaningful work I'd built after leaving Northwestern, I realized that her power to diminish me had evaporated entirely. "Of course," I said. "Would you like a tour?" For the next hour, I showed Patricia Whitman through the collection, explaining how we'd organize the materials, describing the discussion groups and educational programs, sharing stories about visitors who'd found guidance in these books. She listened without her usual critical commentary, asking thoughtful questions about our approach to making academic philosophy accessible to broader audiences. When we reached the display case containing Captain Chen's personal effects, she stopped and read his final letter carefully, her expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. "This is extraordinary work, David," she said finally. I had no idea that community-based philosophy could be so rigorous, so impactful. The admission hung between us like a bridge across 2 years of misunderstanding. I could have responded with anger or satisfaction. Could have reminded her of the dismissive things she'd said about my research, the ways she'd undermined my confidence and pushed me toward leaving academia entirely. Instead, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Gratitude. "I needed to leave Northwestern to find this work," I said honestly. "Your criticism forced me to examine whether I was doing philosophy for the right reasons." It turned out I wasn't. She looked surprised by my response, perhaps expecting defensiveness or resentment. "Your research was always solid, David. I was wrong to dismiss its value. I was so focused on maintaining theoretical purity that I lost sight of philosophy's practical purposes." The apology was more than I'd expected and more generous than I'd probably deserved after harboring resentment for so long. But what struck me most was how little I needed it. Patricia Whitman's approval, which had once felt essential to my professional identity, now seemed irrelevant to the work that actually mattered to me. "We all make mistakes about what's important," I said. "The question is what we do when we realize we were wrong." Before leaving, Patricia asked if she could make a donation to the collection. She'd brought with her a box of books from her personal library, philosophical texts she'd collected during her own graduate studies but rarely referenced in recent years. "These belong where they'll be used," she said, handing me a first edition of William James's The Will to Believe. "I've been keeping them as trophies, but they should be tools." After she left, I spent the evening processing her visit and what it meant for my understanding of the path that had brought me to Riverside. Patricia Whitman's rejection had felt like professional death 2 years ago, but it had actually been liberation from a system that valued performance over purpose, recognition over service. The book sale volunteers who'd treated me with condescension had unknowingly given me a gift as well. Their assumptions about my intellectual capacity had forced me to confront my own assumptions about who deserved access to philosophical inquiry. If I could be misjudged so completely based on appearance and demeanor, how many other people were being excluded from intellectual communities that could enrich their lives? The Chen collection had become my answer to that question, proof that philosophical thinking thrived outside traditional academic settings when it was presented with respect for people's capacity to engage with complex ideas. That night, I sat in my apartment reading Captain Chen's copy of Marcus Aurelius, tracing the young Marine's penciled observations about courage and duty and the examined life. His annotations revealed someone who'd found in ancient Stoic philosophy a framework for modern moral decision-making, who'd used Marcus Aurelius's meditations on mortality and virtue to navigate the ethical challenges of military leadership. One passage, heavily underlined and surrounded by Chen's careful commentary, particularly caught my attention. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Chen had written in the margin, "Control what you can control. Accept what you cannot. The difference between the two is wisdom." Applied this during the Kandahar mission, when everything went wrong. Helped me focus on protecting my Marines instead of questioning decisions made above my pay grade. Reading those words, I understood something new about my own journey, from academic disappointment to meaningful work. I couldn't control Patricia Whitman's assessment of my research or the volunteers' assumptions about my intellectual capacity, but I could control how I responded to those judgments, what I built from the wreckage of my original plans, how I chose to define success and fulfillment. The Chen Memorial Collection existed because I'd stopped trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was lacking, and started focusing on serving people who needed what I could offer. The Thursday evening discussions continued because participants found value in wrestling with hard questions together, regardless of their formal educational backgrounds or professional credentials. As I prepared for bed, I thought about tomorrow's schedule. A morning meeting with a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the collection's story. An afternoon session with graduate students from 3 different universities conducting research in our archives. An evening discussion group focused on Hannah Arendt's Crises of the Republic and its relevance to contemporary military service. Each activity represented a different way of fulfilling Captain Chen's vision of philosophy as a living resource for moral reasoning rather than an abstract intellectual exercise. The collection had become what he'd imagined, a space where ancient wisdom met modern dilemmas, where service members could find intellectual community without academic pretension, where complex questions received the serious attention they deserved. The last thing I did before turning off the lights was check my email, where a message from Thomas Chen was waiting. The Marine Corps had approved his transfer to inactive status so he could begin graduate school in philosophy. He'd been accepted to 3 programs, but he'd chosen to attend the local state university so he could continue working with the Chen collection while completing his degree. Bobby always said that philosophy should serve something larger than itself, he'd written. I want to learn how to carry on his work, how to ask his questions in new contexts. The collection has shown me that intellectual work and military service don't have to be separate things. Reading Thomas's message, I realized that the Chen Memorial Collection had achieved something beyond my original hopes. It had become not just a repository for one Marine's intellectual legacy, but a training ground for the next generation of people committed to applied philosophical work, to asking hard questions about service and sacrifice and moral responsibility. I closed my laptop and looked around my small apartment, at the modest space that had become home during my time in Riverside. Tomorrow would bring new visitors to the collection, new questions to explore, new opportunities to demonstrate that philosophy's highest calling was helping people live more thoughtfully, more ethically, more courageously. The quantum mechanics book from that first library book sale still sat on my bookshelf, but now it was surrounded by philosophy texts that reflected my actual interests and expertise. I no longer needed to prove to anyone that I could understand complex ideas. The proof was in the work itself, in the lives touched by Captain Chen's books and the conversations they'd inspired. Before sleep, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction about the journey from that humiliating October morning to this place of purposeful work. The volunteers who'd tried to steer me away from challenging books had inadvertently led me toward the most challenging and rewarding work of my career. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as obstacles, and sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful from the pieces of what others tried to break. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.